Okay, we're live. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Amanda Perez here at the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. And today we have Professor John Corrigan, who's going to be doing a presentation on traumatic brain injury, mental health, and addiction. This is co-sponsored by ACL, Underserved Populations, and Opioid Use and Mental Health Needs Work Groups. And this is our first of the Brain Injury and Co-occurring Disorders free webinar series. So with that said, John, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you and let you introduce yourself a bit more. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for this invitation. As was indicated, I am a professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Ohio State University. I also direct the Ohio Brain Injury Program, which is in Ohio the legislative mandated lead agency for planning and policy related to living with brain injury. So we are trying to address in Ohio many of the same issues that are being addressed there in Oregon. I have no financial relationships relevant to today's presentation, so let's just jump right in. I think definitions is a good place to start. Traumatic brain injury, first, is an insult to the brain. It is not just a insult to the head or the outer portion, but to the brain itself. And it's caused by an external force. So something has hit the head or the head has hit something, causing the insult to the brain. The way we know it's the brain and not just the head is that it results in an altered state of consciousness. There's some kind of disruption of normal functioning of the brain. And as we'll see in a moment, that can be quite varied in terms of the extent of that disruption. One of the other things to know about traumatic brain injury is that the effects can be temporary or permanent. And there is quite a broad spectrum, as we'll see in a moment. But kind of the downside is that we don't always know which injuries are going to have permanent or long-lasting effects and which ones will have more temporary effects. And we're going to get into that more in this webinar. So a poll question. Obviously, this is rhetorical, but TBI is a life-altering injury for survivors and their families, profoundly impacting the patient's functional status. Or B, TBI is a very common injury that is essentially inconsequential to the individual's functional status following recovery. Or C, TBI is both A and B and everything in between. And you are all good test takers, so I know that you know that the right answer there is C, that there is indeed this tremendous spectrum of traumatic brain injury. And actually, that variability in the effects makes it harder to understand what traumatic brain injury is about, because it's not just one thing, and the variation is a source of some of the confusion. So I'm going to spend a little time just trying to sort out some of the issues around what makes it more towards being inconsequential and more towards being very consequential. So if we look at a continuum first of severity, the severity of a single traumatic brain injury, and think of it as kind of going from left to right there, from least severe to most severe, we can look at the extent to which or how the function of the brain is altered to understand the severity of the injury. So, if one is just dazed and confused, maybe have a gap in memory, that is towards the least severe of the range. But if the injury has actually caused someone to be knocked out or lose consciousness, that's further along the severity range. And then resulting in coma is even more than loss of consciousness, in that the brain is not even doing some of the reflexive reactions that it normally would do, even if you were unconscious. It would have been great if we would have used these distinctions to say what a mild, a moderate, and a severe traumatic brain injury is, but we weren't that smart. And so when we started to define mild, moderate, and severe, We define mild, which, by the way, a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. But we define mild as going all the way from the least severe, the dazed, confused, a gap in memory, through some of the injuries that result in loss of consciousness. Moderate, then, are pretty much the remainder of those that result in loss of consciousness but aren't mild. And then the severe are, for the most part, those that result in coma. So this nomenclature has served to confuse, I think, the kind of basic understandings about severity. But if you knew just a couple of major benchmarks along this severity continuum, you'll know more than 99% of the population about severity of traumatic brain injury. And the first of those benchmarks is whether there was any loss of consciousness. Just in general, that those that result in loss of consciousness or worse are going to have more consequences than those that are less severe and only result in a dazed, confused, being dazed, confused, or having a gap in memory. The other benchmark that's important is whether that loss of consciousness is 30 minutes or more. If it's more than 30 minutes, then it's going to be in the moderate and severe range. And there's even more likelihood then that there's going to be some permanent effects. But this basic understanding of the severity continuum will help you as you are hopefully in the future looking at the people you serve and their history of traumatic brain injury. It will help you to know when they've had a sufficient history that your antenna should be up, that there may be more consequences from it, versus when it might just be inconsequential. Severity of the injury is the biggest driver of the likelihood of consequences. That is an absolute true statement, but it is not the only driver of the consequences of injury. And so I want to talk about just a couple more. The first is cumulative effects from having multiple TBIs. And as you'll see in a moment, this is something you know something about because if you haven't been hiding in the woods for the last 15 years. But the cumulative effects, and these are particularly of mild traumatic brain injuries, TBIs maybe that we wouldn't expect to have a consequence. The cumulative effect could be because of number, having many of them, multiple of them, or it could be spacing. It could be that having two mild injuries too close together where the brain has not fully recuperated from the first and then having the second is why there are additional consequences. But as I said, if you have not been in the woods without a television, since in the last 10 to 15 years, we've been very concerned about concussion in sports. And during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we came to realize that our soldiers were being exposed to multiple brain injuries through blast forces, and not just blasts, but the improvised explosive devices were causing both blast and traditional mechanical injury, hitting your head against the side of the Humvee, being knocked to the ground, and maybe hitting your head on a rock or whatever. So both of those, the public awareness of both of those occurred around the same time, as a matter of fact, and led us to realize that even with mild injuries, if there are multiple, there can be consequences that look more like a more severe injury. So, military personnel and athletes, particularly those in contact sports, are two of the groups that may have had these multiple mild TBIs, but we need to keep in mind there are others. For instance, victims of intimate partner violence, in particular, have had multiple mild traumatic brain injuries. The head is the most likely place that somebody is hit, particularly in the hair, so that it hides bruising. And that can often be combined with denying the brain oxygen. And while that's not a traumatic brain injury, it's an anoxic brain injury, but choking, which is also very common in intimate partner violence, is another way that there is mild compromise of the brain. Persons who begin misusing and abusing substances, what we see is that as intoxication becomes regular, so do the number of injuries that result in traumatic brain injuries, whether that's falling down the steps, getting in a fight, having a moving vehicle crash that results in hitting the head. The incidence of traumatic brain injury goes up significantly once intoxication becomes regular. And there are other vulnerable populations. We can't get into all of these today, but those with psychiatric disorders, among the homeless, very high rates, as well as among inmates in prisons and jails. So multiple mild traumatic brain injury as another source of consequences is not just an issue among those who served in combat or those who take part in contact sports. Beyond, so we've talked about severity, we've talked about cumulative effects. There's a couple other I'm just going to mention, but and this will come back in a small way later in the talk. But there's an interaction between traumatic brain injury and development that also will dictate or result in greater consequences. There's quite a bit of study going on right now about childhood injuries that carry consequences into adulthood. But we also suspect that at the other end of the aging spectrum, that a even mild traumatic brain injury and among an older adult may serve as kind of a sentinel event for changing their the extent of their independence. When we're talking about lifetime history of TBI, we sometimes forget to think about the recent ones. And if there's somebody you're working with who had a concussion over the weekend, they're going to be in a different state of mind, different readiness to work with you this week than if they hadn't had that over the weekend. So never forgetting that a recent injury can have immediate consequences, even if they're going to resolve, is something to keep in mind. And finally, there's an interaction, just as there is a cumulative effect among traumatic brain injuries, there can be a cumulative effect among other neurologic conditions. I've mentioned anoxia, when you combine denying the brain of oxygen with hitting the brain with when there's an external force. Those two combine in a worse way. But somebody who, for instance, might have a history of a stroke, but then has a traumatic brain injury, may exhibit more consequences, even when that traumatic brain injury is mild. So other sources of neurologic compromise can interact with the traumatic brain injury to make more consequences. So just to recap, I realize this has been going rather quickly, but TBI specifically is when there's an external force of some sort that alters the normal functioning of the brain. It can be temporary or permanent. The vast majority of true TBIs are temporary, but when they're more severe, cumulative, recent, or combined with other neurologic conditions, then there's a greater likelihood of being permanent. There is quite a range, which is confusing. Don't ever forget that a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, and they have these cumulative effects, including with there's an interaction with normal development. So that's kind of the brief primer. But let's talk just for a moment about how common traumatic brain injuries are. These are data from two states, Colorado and Ohio, where there's telephone polling of the non-institutionalized adults in that state. And these are the population rates of lifetime history of traumatic brain injury that they found. The interview in Colorado was more elaborate, and so they were able to detect any TBI, even those that just resulted in being dazed or confused, and some 43% of adults had at least one such incident in their life. More importantly, and in both surveys, we were able to look at having at least one TBI that resulted in loss of consciousness. And there the number is more like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 in those two states. And I think really important, although loss of consciousness is important, but having a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury, it was 6% among Coloradoans. And again, this is non-institutionalized adults, and 3% in Ohio. So that, let's say that moderate severe is roughly, 5%. That means if you just grab 20 adults off the street and were to screen them, you would find at least one of them had a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury sometime in their life. And as many as, let's say 4 or 5 would have had at least one TBI with loss of consciousness. But we also know that the people who come into our programs, particularly our behavioral health programs for treatment, are not just the typical adult on the sidewalk. And so studies where we've tried to look at the prevalence of lifetime history in treatment populations, a series of studies that I'll show you a little bit more about in a moment, in substance use disorder treatment settings in Ohio, we found double the percentage that had a TBI with a loss of consciousness and triple those who had a moderate or severe. Though this is a small study and it needs replication, but an early study on psychiatric inpatients found a similar prevalence of lifetime history among those patients with psychiatric histories. And a series of studies done of persons who are homeless also found these elevated prevalence rates for persons in those studies. So, and I could show you prisoners and we'd see a similar thing. And so if you just look at the TBI with loss of consciousness, now it's not 4 or 5 out of 20 that if you pick randomly, but it's approaching half of the people in your waiting room, if you're a substance abuse treatment program, have had at least one TBI with loss of consciousness, and 1 in 5 will have had at least a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury. And in the brain injury rehabilitation world, we are awfully sure that when you see somebody who's had a history of moderate or severe traumatic brain injury, they may not have residual disability due to that injury, but there is some way in which it is affecting their thinking or their processing of emotions in today. So that increased prevalence, particularly in our treatment populations, is another reason why it's important that we be more aware of history of traumatic brain injury in our behavioral health settings. So I'll just show you, these are those series of studies we did in Ohio in different substance abuse treatment settings. Adolescents, so those 18 or less, we did a series of 3 residential treatment programs where we screened everybody coming in for a 6-month period. And, some 1 in 4 of those kids already had at least one TBI with loss of consciousness, not any TBI, but at least loss of consciousness. In our more intensive settings, adult residential, intensive outpatient, in a therapeutic community, in one of our prisons, it was half had a TBI with loss of consciousness. And though small, but rural-based, 2-county integrated dual diagnosis treatment program, we found some 70% had a history of TBI with loss of consciousness. And that study was replicated in a dual diagnosis treatment program in Washington, D.C., and found a similar rate. So it's prevalent in our substance use disorder treatment settings. In terms of more general psychiatric diagnoses, a large study done in Denmark looked at 1.4 million individuals over a long period of time. And the question they really sought to ask is, once you've had a traumatic brain injury, are you more likely to later then get a psychiatric diagnosis, be treated for a psychiatric diagnosis? So in their cohort, they excluded anybody who had a psychiatric diagnosis before they had the traumatic brain injury. And then they looked at, what's the relative rate, how common is a later diagnosis. They compared it to persons who had no injury at all. So persons with traumatic brain injury versus no injury, but they also compared persons with traumatic brain injury to those with orthopedic injuries only, meaning a limb might have been broken, but there was no indication of traumatic brain injury. And the reason for that is that some suspect that some of what we see in terms of that looks like the later effect of a traumatic brain injury may be more a psychological phenotype, a kind of person whose personality leads them to take risks, for instance, and other things. But those risks they take result in an injury, and it just so happens for some it's a traumatic brain injury, for others, it's an orthopedic injury. And so that's why we often don't just compare to the general population, but also to those with some other kind of injury, but not a traumatic brain injury. So these were the results from that study. That what you see in green is the general population, in blue are those with an orthopedic injury, and in red are those who had a head injury or traumatic brain injury. And you see the likelihoods for each of 4 of these diagnoses. Remembering this spanned a large period of time, so the various versions of the DSM were in play. But on the far right there, for organic mental disorders, that very, very high rate for traumatic brain injury probably represents some recognition that the development of the symptoms were connected in time, at least, to a recent traumatic brain injury or a persistent one with persistent effects. But what you see then in the other diagnoses, and as well, is that in all cases, those with traumatic brain injury were more likely to have these diagnoses than the general population. And for both schizophrenia and bipolar depression, they were also more likely than persons with orthopedic injuries. It was really only in bipolar disorder that persons with orthopedic injury and traumatic brain injury were about as likely to have that particular diagnosis. So there's a tremendous relationship. The point here is these all were diagnoses that followed in person's life after experiencing a traumatic brain injury. There's also a quickly growing evidence that suicide and prior history of TBI are very much related. A large study done in Sweden, and the reason that we see more than our share of studies coming out of Scandinavia is that because of the way data is collected in the general population there, we can combine records from the hospitalizations and outpatient treatment and mortality and substance abuse treatment and participation in social programs like unemployment and other things. Those can be combined. And so many of our large-scale population studies do come out of Scandinavia. In this case, 2.5 million Swedes were looked at for likelihood of suicide following a traumatic brain injury. Compared to others of the same sex and age, they're 3 times more likely. And this study was unique in that they were able to compare the persons with traumatic brain injury to siblings from the same family. So exposed to the same parenting, exposed to the same neighborhood and economic influences, they were still twice as likely as uninjured siblings to commit suicide. A study, another study out of Denmark found that compared to people of the same age and sex and from the same period of time, were twice as likely to 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide than if they'd had a prior TBI. And if you just limited it to severe TBIs, it was almost 3.5 times more likely. So the severity of the injury is increasing the risk, which these studies can really only be interpreted as association, not necessarily causality. But when with increased severity, one gets increased risk, that tends to suggest that it might be a causal relationship. In the U.S., a large study, I think it was of 8 to 10 different healthcare systems actually combined data and looked at how the relationship between various comorbid conditions and the likelihood of suicide. This was accounting for sex, age, and psychiatric diagnosis, including substance use disorder. Having a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury increased your odds of suicide by almost 9-1. And of all medical conditions, it was the highest association in this study. So the relationship with suicide is not insignificant. Finally, in terms of opioids, while this research is emerging with a colleague at Brandeis, Rachel Seiko Adams, we recently published a commentary on addictive behaviors where we pointed out that first, persons with traumatic brain injury are more likely to be prescribed opioids. There's a number of reasons for that, but the bottom line is that their exposure risk is higher than persons without traumatic brain injury. We then describe how, given they have a traumatic brain injury, they're more susceptible to the addictive influence of opioids, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. And then if they do develop a problem with opioid use, they have more challenges in successful treatment, which we are also going to talk about more in a moment. So in essence, the opioid epidemic was a perfect storm for in general, but particularly persons with traumatic brain injury, because they had this increased exposure, more likely to become addicted, more likely to have challenges or difficulties in successful treatment. So you might be wondering why this association? Why are we seeing this relationship between traumatic brain injury and behavioral health conditions? And this is something that I wish everybody knew about traumatic brain injury, but now you will. And that's that the fingerprint is damage to the frontal areas of the brain. This is regardless where the impact is on the head, whether you hit the front, the back, the side, whether something hits you anywhere on the head. If there is enough force that the brain jiggles essentially within the cranial vault, then there will also be injury in the frontal areas. Yeah, you may have bruising in the back where the actual blow came, but you're also going to have greater likelihood of bruising or contusion in the frontal areas as well. And the reason for that is that, as I said, that the force moves the brain within the cranial vault. For the most part, that's okay because the inside of the cranial vault is smooth, and there is kind of a gelatinous material that is there to protect the brain. But as shown here on the left, in the very front, there are bony ridges where the inside of the cranial vault is not smooth. And if you get enough exchange of energy that the brain is jiggling within the cranial vault, then you are more likely to get contusion or bruising in these frontal areas, as is depicted there on the right. So, going back in time, whether our early studies on autopsies there on the right, or more recent studies using MRI, what we've always found is that overall, the brain can be injured anywhere. The frontal areas are the most likely to also have some kind of effect of traumatic brain injury. And what I would suggest to you, this kind of simplified representation of the various functions subserved by different parts of the brain, is that at least in our society, in modern day society, human society, if you're going to pick a part of the brain to injure, this is not the frontal lobes, the frontal areas are not the one to pick. That if you look at some of those functions like initiation, problem solving, judgment, inhibition of impulse, self-monitoring, these are abilities that kind of underlie our capability for living successfully in society. Many of them are ones we're not born with as children, but we learn over time and are part of being an adult who is not in trouble and is able to sustain their independence. And furthermore, if you think about these functions of the frontal lobes, that if you do get in trouble, if you do develop a psychiatric disorder, if you do develop a substance use disorder, some of these very same skills are what we count on in treatment for improvement. So it's kind of a double whammy that these frontal areas of the brain are so critical to successful living in society, and they are also critical to us righting the ship when we were having problems. So that relationship, and I've talked here mostly about the bruising part of it, but it goes actually beyond bruising. But this fingerprint of traumatic brain injury being these frontal areas and resulting in what are sometimes called these executive function weaknesses or problems is really the key to understanding the effects of traumatic brain injury. It is not the only thing, however, and this is a schematic that colleagues of mine at West Virginia University have published. They are particularly interested in the developmental implications of a traumatic brain injury, so how juvenile injury may result in adult alcohol abuse in particular. They are primarily actually animal researchers, not human researchers. But in general, what they propose is that there's, perhaps three different routes between traumatic brain injury and alcohol use disorders. On the right there, you see some of the psychosocial factors, and that are ones I think we can understand more readily. But they've also suggested that there are at least two other routes to this relationship between traumatic brain injury and, in this case, alcohol use disorders. The first being neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation occurs naturally when there's an injury to the brain. It's what we need to, in the immediate post-injury period, to recover, to get rid of any debris that may have built up. It's just like when you cut yourself, on the wrist. There's an inflammatory process that the body engages in order to heal that cut on the skin. Same with your brain. It is, though, supposed to dampen back down or go back to its more normal state, after the job of the cleanup has occurred. But what we suspect in traumatic brain injury is that with the more severe injuries or the cumulative effects of mild injuries, that neuroinflammatory process may persist. And in the case of alcohol use disorder, there's this cyclic effect where essentially the persistence of the neuroinflammation makes one more predisposed to alcohol. You might say, increases the craving for the alcohol, but then the consumption of the alcohol helps maintain the neuroinflammation. And so it becomes cyclic, and it sustains the pattern over time. Again, understand that while this portrays it in humans, this is being primarily studied in animals. The other hypothesis that's been suggested of the relationship between TBI and addictions, as well as other behavioral health disorders, is that there's a disruption of the dopaminergic pathways. And this slide shows some of those connections from the midbrain up, particularly into the frontal lobes. And you'll recognize that this was the part of the brain we were just looking at that is more susceptible to contusion. These connectors are also more susceptible to being torn or sheared because of just the way all the tissue is packed into the frontal areas. And so this disruption of the dopaminergic pathways lays the groundwork for addictive, if not other problems. And you might think this is a schematic of the brain that's being used in traumatic brain injury. This is actually the classic schematic for the addiction pathways of the brain, and you see the significance then in terms of traumatic brain injury. So the association, why there would be why traumatic brain injury, which we now know is common, which we now know affects the frontal areas of the brain, and why it is, at least we're starting to recognize why it might be so prevalent, particularly in behavioral health populations. And at this point, I hope that I've provided you at least with enough evidence to support this statement, and that's that wherever you're working, whether you're in a mental health setting, a substance abuse, criminal justice system, whatever, it is worthwhile to know whether the person you are working with has had a traumatic brain injury. It is worthwhile to know if they have enough of a history that they may be having particularly some of these subtle frontal lobe problems that we were just looking at. What are their cognitive abilities like? How aware are they of their own behavior? How aware are they of their own feelings and emotions? How good are they at planning and organizing what they're doing? These are all questions that could very much affect the likelihood of your success working with them, and it's why we think this statement is true. Yet you need to know the person you're working with's lifetime history of traumatic brain injury. So just to transition, quickly here, we probably have spent more time looking at this relationship relative to substance use disorders than other behavioral health disorders. And so what I thought might be useful is to just talk about some of the lessons learned, at least to date, from looking at TBI and SUD. And then we'll come back more to general implications. So the first is that for those of us who have been working at this intersection, there are two clinical observations that just are inescapable. And the first of those is that when somebody has both a substance use disorder and a traumatic brain injury, there's an even greater disconnect between their intention to change their behavior and their success in changing it. Now, I say even greater because if it was just a matter of saying, oh, I'm going to stop using, and you just stopped, then we could close down half of our substance use disorder treatment facilities. But we all know that even when after you get to the point that you recognize you have a problem, that then turning that recognition into successful sobriety is the rest of the story. Well, that gap, that disconnect is even more pronounced in persons with traumatic brain injury. The other consistent clinical observation is that clients in substance use disorder treatment with a traumatic brain injury are more likely to prematurely terminate. They don't make it through the expected course, and are typically, that is characterized as being non-compliant. And what I want to do is take a little more time to particularly look at both of these, actually, but particularly the second one about why is there this treatment failure? Why is there this non-compliance? So what we're going to look at is actually three reasons for why that's occurring. And the first of those is that the neurobehavioral consequences that we were just looking at, those frontal lobe problems around poor attention, poor memory, poor impulse control, lack of self-awareness, lack of awareness of your behavior, effect of your behavior on others, those neurobehavioral consequences undermine the ability to participate, at least conventionally, in treatment. And I say conventionally there because I don't think it means that you need to be in a different treatment setting. Au contraire, it means that our treatment settings need to be more adaptive and accommodating of some of these neurobehavioral consequences. The first of these is cognitive load, that we don't realize it, but there is a a demand for cognitive function that's part of much of our treatment. Some of that can come as simple as what is the amount of treatment that's provided in group. A group setting is a much more difficult learning setting for somebody who has impaired attention, for instance, or isn't able to focus and concentrate, or has poor memory. But some of our treatment settings also expect that there is a learning of rules and vocabulary and other aspects of the treatment which have a cognitive load. And so if we think that all our clients are equal in terms of their ability to cognitively take part in treatment, we are making a mistake, and what that's going to do is result in those with poor cognitive abilities and people who may not even be aware that they have poor cognitive abilities not succeeding in treatment. More insidious is when we misattribute a behavior that particularly may be a neurobehavioral behavior, a neurologically generated behavior, and think that it's something else. Think that it's something intentional or a representation of a person's motivation or psychological state. So if in group there's a member who talks too much, and that may be disinhibition, that may be specifically related to the frontal lobe damage. But if the other group members, attribute to that, well, they're just self-centered. They're just a big ego. They just don't care. They just think they're the only person in group. They are making an attribution about that behavior that relates to the person's personality. Not that they have trouble inhibiting or that they miss that they are talking too much, but that they are actually arrogant or looking down on the other group members. Even worse, if the professional involved doesn't recognize, let's say somebody misses an appointment and jumps to the conclusion that that's because they have poor motivation for change, and confront the individual next time they see them for that. But if the real reason is that they are disorganized and have a poor memory, and that night neglected to set their alarm or tell their parent that they needed to get a ride to the center the next day, then we've made a misattribution that missing that appointment was due to not being motivated versus not having good memory or not being well organized. And if you work in the brain injury rehabilitation world, showing up for an appointment is not a given. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our patients remember to come to get the treatment, because it's common that they don't. So this disconnect, and not in the treatment world, not seeing that not all behavior is a reflection of a person's internal motivation or psychological state, but some behavior can be a reflection of their neurologic state. And spending some time trying to figure out when it's one or the other is really important to success in treatment. And if you talk to folks who have dropped out of treatment, who prematurely terminate, who have a traumatic brain injury, often the words you get are things like, well, they just didn't get me. They didn't understand me. Or I don't think that program was going to be helpful for people like me. And the like me isn't like having a brain injury. They're just simply saying there was a disconnect and there was an undermining of whatever therapeutic alliance, should have developed as part of their initial participation. So when I talk about participating conventionally in treatment, what I'm talking about is not different programs. I'm talking about our programs being accommodating for the person who has these frontal lobe or executive kinds of problems. All right, second. It is already well known that there are a tremendous number of co-occurring psychiatric and actually medical disorders that come with traumatic brain injury. And I'm only going to show 2 slides here. I could easily do a whole hour on this, just showing you one study after another. But this came from a state of Kentucky, where for 1 year they screened everybody coming into any state-funded substance abuse treatment program, screened them for history of traumatic brain injury. In blue there you see those who no TBI was identified. In red, they identified at least 1 TBI with loss of consciousness, and in yellow, more than 1 TBI with loss of consciousness. And they're coming in for substance abuse treatment, but you see down the left there the various other comorbid conditions that were that they also were experiencing, and how the likelihood of those increased with greater number of traumatic brain injuries with loss of consciousness. And like I said, this has been replicated in many settings. This actually is a little bit dated now, but I like it for its comprehensiveness, that it was everybody coming into treatment for a year. And even in our populations with the greatest acuity, thinking about our duly diagnosed substance use disorder and severe mental illness, the study I mentioned before that was done in DC found that even in this really impaired population, that having a history of traumatic brain injury increased various likelihood of other comorbid conditions, whether it was psychiatric symptomology, psychosocial more arrest, greater homelessness, more likelihood of PTSD, as well as antisocial and borderline personality disorders. And then, by the way, that has been found in other studies as well. And even the earlier age at first TBI was associated with a greater likelihood of psychotic spectrum disorder. So even in our most severe, still a history of traumatic brain injury is affecting the presentation. So that's the first 2. And then finally, one of the things that we think we've learned with experience is that those with a traumatic brain injury have less ability to sustain the improvements from treatment without continued support or external structure. And I'm just going to show one slide here. I can't really do this, do it justice, but this was from the 2-county dual diagnosis treatment program here in Ohio. And the staff during the it was a targeted capacity expansion grant, and during that grant had no idea who had a traumatic brain injury and who didn't. It just was something that the person doing the initial assessments had decided to add to the assessments and never looked at it again until the funding was over. But as the program was winding down, they asked staff, who is going to succeed if we continue to succeed if we have to stop this program? Who has a poor prognosis? And what you see there on the far left is that they disproportionately identified the persons with a history of traumatic brain injury as less likely to succeed and needing more ongoing support. Yes, you see that there, and you see over here that those with no TBI were more likely judged as being able to succeed even if they had minimal or no support. And the big difference, what we found in kind of debriefing after the fact, was that the persons with traumatic brain injury, again, nobody knew who was whom, ended up being far greater users of some of the community supports or case management that was part of the dual diagnosis treatment. And the staff felt that that need continued. And while those without TBI, once they got stabilized on medications, maybe got into a more stable housing environment, they saw them as more likely to be able to succeed without continued support. So one of the things we say, is that, if you have a client with a traumatic brain injury, when you think you're done, you may not be. And that we have to look more deeply at the extent to which they are going to be supported by their environment to continue with whatever success they've attained. So the net result of all this is that, at least in substance abuse treatment, we think there are some things that need to be incorporated into everyday planning. The first of these is routine screening. You simply need to know if the person you're working with does or does not have this lifetime history, because if they have enough of a history, then the likelihood that there are some of these executive function weaknesses that are also going to affect your treatment is way more pronounced. Second, we think that substance use treatment providers need to develop some, kind of additional skill set for accommodating neurobehavioral deficits, things like short attention span, poor memory, disinhibited behavior, poor insight, and others. It's those frontal lobe functions that we looked at earlier. It needs to be part of our repertoire to be able to provide that extra that allows a person to participate in our treatment, accommodating those neurobehavioral deficits. And that's not just a whole webinar, that's several webinars, and I think will be the subject matter of future ones in this series. Got to be ready for comorbidities, actually comorbid psychiatric as well as medical problems. And we need to think of this person holistically. We can't say, go get your sleep disturbance fixed and then you can come back into treatment. It can't be sequential. It has to be holistic. And that means probably having multiple providers or specialists, communicating with each other. And it also means that we have to be ready for the complexity. Complexity is not the outlier. Complex individuals are the bread and butter of particularly the public treatment programs. And rather than conveying to someone, ooh, you're complicated, I don't know, we should be conveying to them, we treat and we are successful with people with comorbid interactions who are complicated, and make sure that we're expressing that from the beginning so that their expectations are also high for success. And finally, we have to do more to pay attention to both formal and informal supports needed during and after treatment. A complete treatment plan has to be thinking about what has changed about this person's environment, both their social environment, their physical environment, that's going to allow them to sustain this improvement. This is not an idea that's foreign to substance abuse treatment. We used to spend a lot more time thinking about aftercare, but it is critical when it's a person with a traumatic brain injury. And so these are recommendations we've made for those in substance use disorder treatment, but the rest of you who are not in substance use disorder and other parts of behavioral health really are not off the hook, because these same recommendations apply across behavioral health, not just to substance use disorders. And so this is really a change we need to be making proactively in how we screen and the training for our professional staff and how we conceptualize our treatment plan and planning. So with that, I'm going to stop. You may feel like you've been drinking from a fire hose. I feel like I've been spitting out information like a fire hose. And I think I understand that there's a little bit of time here for questions.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive presentation. We do have a question from Russ Spearman, and he says, question 4 from the OSU TBI ID does pick up violence as a cause of TBI. Is there a tool or question that researchers are using to extract IPV, intimate partner violence?
So there are a couple of tools that have been used for screening for traumatic brain injury that have been adapted for intimate partner violence. One in particular was developed by our Ohio Domestic Violence Network here. The main accommodation being used is that trying to get at both traumatic brain injury and anoxic brain injury because of the high incidence of choking. It is really important to be looking at both. And so folks have developed kind of really brief screens that ask about both. And then we have worked with a couple states to adapt the instrument we developed here at Ohio State for detecting lifetime history of traumatic brain injury, to adapt it to also pick up anoxic injuries, denying the brain oxygen, as well as other actually sources of brain compromise that might be co-occurring. And those adaptations I can make available to anybody who is interested.
Thank you. We have a question from Catherine Klein. She asks if you can explain the cycle of neuroinflammation and alcohol abuse again. She's not sure that it was clear and doesn't understand the link.
Well, I'm not going to be able to do it justice, and if you're really interested in doing a deep dive, there are at least, I think now, 3 different labs, animal labs, all working on this relationship. But the basic idea is that if the neuroinflammation does not resolve, if you essentially stay in a hyper-inflamed state, that for reasons not so clear to me, but that are coming clearer in some of this research, that also increases the craving for, in this case, it was alcohol. So these were mice that were injured as juveniles, and then when they looked at them later as adults and their just natural consumption of alcohol, the ones with the traumatic brain injury seem to be more predisposed to alcohol. The cyclic effect then comes is that if you put alcohol into an inflamed brain, then you sustain the inflammation. And so then that's how you get the cyclic effect. I'm not sure I really added more to what I said earlier, and there some of the cellular basis for that, frankly, is beyond my expertise, but I can direct you to the research.
Okay, maybe we can send out links later following the webinar.
Sure.
Okay, so then we have a question from Jerome Larkin, and he says, in my appeals of denials of long-term disability benefits for cognitive disorders, I often have to prove there are objective medical findings of the disabling condition. What are the crucial objective medical findings supporting a diagnosis of TBI?
Well, the forensic or the legal, assessment needed to establish that a traumatic brain injury has occurred, is different from what I've been talking about here in terms of screening. Screening is a clinical tool, while the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury is a clinical tool. And in a forensic setting, being able to tie the injury to the consequence, there are further implications for that. So I can't do that question justice. Just let me say there's no real substitute for having detection methods done, whether it's imaging nowadays, blood work and or neuropsychological testing that's done in proximity to the injury, so that it's easier to determine this is related to the injury and this is not. When we're many years post, while we can screen for it, it's not the kind of relationship that at this point stands up in court or through other proceedings as evidence of causality. I will say this, though, that with the OSU TBI identification method, this structured interview we've developed, now there are, I think it's at least a half dozen, it could be more than that now, studies where they found that findings from this screening are associated with actual structural changes in the brain. But it just, what rises to the ability to make causal inference in legal setting is much different.
Thank you. Shannon Peterson is asking, what factors contribute to homeless having such a high prevalence of TBIs?
I think there's multiple things occurring there. As you know, if you work with that population, that there are a lot of comorbid conditions, particularly behavioral health conditions. So some of those same things we looked at with behavioral health more generally. But homelessness, you are subjecting yourself to a more dangerous environment, and we know that some of the camps that are on the land are very dangerous places to be. There is intoxication, there's fighting, etc. So I think in terms of homelessness, it's probably a confluence of multiple risk factors that then leading to the high incidence of traumatic brain injury.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Looks like this question is more for us. So Kirsten, we will be, this webinar is recorded and it will be available to share out. We plan on having this up on our website at cbert.org within the next week. And we'll email out the link to that. Okay, well, I think that's it for our questions today. Thank you so very much. We appreciate your time. And for anybody who has any further questions for us or for John, feel free to email us. You should have our links from the emails that we've sent out. And we will be continuing our series with Carolyn Lensky. So stay tuned for future webinars. Thank you all so much.
Take care.